Occupational oncology faces a disconnect. In laboratories, evidence that night shift work causes cancer appears definitive, but in macro-level population data, that certainty dissolves. For years, the baseline consensus was clear. In 2007, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified circadian disrupting shift work as a probable human carcinogen. Biology supports this classification. Mammals rely on a master clock in the hypothalamus called the SCN. This master clock synchronizes physiological processes to a 24-hour cycle. Artificial light at night directly disrupts it. Light hitting the retina during sleep hours interrupts SCN signaling, halting the pineal gland secretion of melatonin. Without melatonin's anti-tumor protections, the body experiences a dysregulation of estrogen signaling and a spike in inflammatory cytokines, bypassing normal immune defenses. Specific epidemiological cohorts appeared to validate this mechanism. Data from the Finnish twin cohort showed elevated hazard ratios for breast cancer among night shift workers, independent of shared genetic factors. High biological plausibility, combined with isolated, alarming cohort data, solidified a rigid professional assumption. For many practitioners, working night shifts became definitively carcinogenic. Then, the macro-level data emerged. A comprehensive Frontiers meta-analysis aggregated 57 studies, examining a dataset of 8.4 million participants. The meta-analysis revealed a stark anomaly. The pooled risk estimate for breast cancer among night shift workers yielded an odds ratio of 1.009. Statistically, that is an effectively null result. To understand why this massive dataset contradicts isolated cohorts, we must account for publication bias, the tendency for academic journals to publish positive findings while rejecting studies that show no effect. This Beggs funnel plot graphs published studies on shift work and cancer. The asymmetric gap highlights a void where unpublished negative results should appear. Using trim and fill analysis, statisticians simulate these suppressed studies and insert them to balance the distribution. With the filled data, associations change. Elevated risks for breast, prostate, and colorectal cancers drop back to the 1.0 baseline. The simulated statistics even show a measurable risk reduction for skin and lung cancers among shift workers. This noise in the data stems from a severe epidemiological flaw. Across these thousands of studies, there are no uniform exposure metrics. Researchers use completely different definitions for what constitutes shift work, making direct comparisons nearly impossible. Severe methodological heterogeneity, compounded by decades of publication bias, created a false positive. This fracture between the lab and population data dismantled the scientific consensus, leaving practitioners without a clear directive. This fractured data creates an epistemic void. Medical professionals and workers are caught between highly plausible biological mechanisms and null population statistics. When populations face a hidden occupational danger but lack definitive data, they reflexively construct myths to fill the vacuum. Behavioral sociology provides a framework for understanding this reaction. The mechanisms that drive professional and public misinformation operate identically to the mechanisms that build conspiracy theories. The core concept here is a crippled epistemology. This occurs when a person's access to information is restricted or highly curated, making it rational for them to hold false beliefs based on the limited data they see. Under a crippled epistemology, individuals isolate a single, easily digestible data point. In the case of shift work, that anchor becomes the 2007 IARC carcinogen classification. This isolated point is elevated to absolute truth. Any contradictory nuance, like the Frontiers meta-analysis or the null data on breast cancer risk, is actively rejected. Without a comprehensive framework to weigh conflicting data, populations build closed informational loops. They prioritize the certainty of fear over the ambiguity of statistical reality. A crippled epistemology becomes weaponized within a community through a process known as group polarization. As isolated networks of practitioners or citizens form, they begin exclusively sharing the positive, mechanistic data points that confirm their established fears. These tight networks reflexively repel the null data points. The meta-analyses and corrected funnel plots never penetrate the cluster. The behavioral outcome is predictable. When individuals discuss an issue within these echo chambers, they leave holding a more extreme position than when they entered. Once polarized, the belief system becomes self-sealing. Conflicting data is no longer evaluated on its methodological merits. A study showing zero cancer risk is not read as a scientific update, it is read as a threat to the group's identity. Here is the conspiratorial pivot. Negative results are dismissed entirely, often framed as evidence of an institutional cover-up, corporate interference, or a flawed government agenda. This creates a recursive loop. The group views any scientific attempt to dispel the theory as definitive proof that the conspiracy is real. Group polarization transforms a simple scientific disagreement into a resilient, self-sealing myth, one that cannot be broken by simply publishing more accurate data. The field of occupational health must navigate this treacherous intersection. They have to address the noisy data while managing the public myth. The solution requires strict epistemic hygiene when evaluating future occupational risks. The foundational principle is that epidemiological evidence cannot prove causality in a vacuum. This diagram illustrates the mandatory triad of risk evaluation. Valid risk assessment requires the precise intersection of epidemiology, experimental toxicology, and mechanistic studies. Future research mandates strict adherence here. We need metrics that precisely define shift intensity and frequency. Researchers must also include chronotype effect modifiers to understand genetic susceptibility to artificial light at night. Until these strict, universal methodologies are applied, the baseline data will remain too fractured to form definitive, evidence-based public health policies. For practitioners operating today, the corrected data requires a shift in assessing night shift risks. The magnitude of cancer risk from night shifts is likely much lower than originally thought, and statistically, it may even be zero. To address the remaining misconceptions, public health communicators face a strategic imperative. They must actively infiltrate these closed epistemic loops. This infiltration requires transparent, rigorous methodology. Top-down declarations of fact only trigger further polarization. The data must be presented with clear, accessible logic that generates concentric rings of clarity through the noise. Public health fails without a dual literacy: the biological mechanisms of disease and the behavioral mechanics of how populations misinterpret data.
Meet Clara Narratio, curious audio for a noisy world. Start your day with the Daily World Brief, make sense of markets with financial candy, and follow Brain Candy for strange ideas, history, culture, technology, and the questions that make learning stick. You'll also find classic audiobooks, plus book candy companions that bring great books into sharper focus. Follow Clara Narratio on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. Better yet, visit claranarratio.com. claranarratio.com. Curious audio, no fluff.
A massive 2016 analysis of over 800,000 women concluded that working night shifts does not increase the risk of developing breast cancer. Even with this definitive data available, the older, debunked narrative linking the two continues to circulate in online forums and health blogs. We have seen how difficult it is to erase a medical myth once it takes root. In 1998, a study falsely linked the MMR vaccine to autism. Although the research was proven fraudulent and retracted years ago, its influence still shapes the health choices of thousands of parents today. This raises a difficult question for public health. When the scientific method provides a verifiable answer, why does such a large portion of the public choose to look the other way? The survival of these myths suggests that providing more facts isn't enough. To understand why denial thrives, we have to look at the specific ways the human mind handles information that makes it feel unsafe. When the brain is faced with a complex, frightening topic, like a cancer diagnosis or a global pandemic, it relies on heuristics. These are mental shortcuts that help us process threats and reach conclusions quickly. But these shortcuts fail when we hit a new scientific consensus that contradicts our established habits or identity. This creates cognitive dissonance, a state of mental tension that we are biologically wired to resolve. We resolve that tension through motivated reasoning. As this diagram illustrates, we subconsciously filter incoming information, attempting to force the facts to fit our pre-existing goals. This leads to belief perseverance. Even when presented with direct evidence that our original view is wrong, we often grow more attached to it, treating the correction as an attack on our judgment. These combined internal pressures turn science denial into a form of biological self-defense. It allows the mind to maintain its emotional equilibrium when the world feels unpredictable. These individual biases scale into social movements through cultural cognition. People tend to credit or dismiss evidence of risk based on whether it fits the values of their community. Over time, this creates crippled epistemologies, isolated informational loops where a group only trusts experts who confirm what they already believe. Within these loops, an informational cascade takes over. Once enough people in a trusted circle accept a false claim, others follow suit because the sheer number of believers makes the claim feel plausible. This is reinforced by reputational cascades. Individuals who may have private doubts often stay silent or publicly agree with the group to avoid being ostracized by their peers. As the group deliberates exclusively with itself, it experiences polarization. Without any outside information to balance the scale, the shared belief becomes more extreme and harder to challenge. These dynamics turn a single person's cognitive bias into a culturally hardened reality, creating a social network that is functionally closed to mainstream science. This isolation provides an opening for the conspiracy entrepreneur. These are actors who intentionally monetize or weaponize these echo chambers for personal or political gain. They often employ the Galileo argument, comparing themselves to persecuted geniuses of the past. This frames their rejection by the scientific community as proof that they are right. To maintain their influence, they use the Flick toolkit, deploying fake experts, using logical fallacies, and impossible expectations to keep their followers in a state of constant suspicion. They take advantage of availability cascades by hijacking highly visible, terrifying events. When TWA Flight 800 exploded in 1996, the vacuum of information was immediately filled with theories of government missiles, which took years for investigators to officially dismantle. These exploiters succeed because they offer the one thing the scientific method cannot: the feeling of absolute certainty in a random and chaotic world. These psychological layers create a self-sealing system. Because the group views outside authorities as part of the conspiracy, direct attempts to debunk their views are often ignored. Aggressive fact-checking can even trigger psychological reactance. When people feel their freedom to believe is being threatened, they often double down on the false narrative to regain a sense of control. Because retroactive corrections so often fail to change minds, researchers are now turning toward a proactive strategy called cognitive inoculation. By warning people about the specific tactics used by denialists, like the FLIC playbook, before they encounter the misinformation, we can help them recognize the manipulation as it's happening. Treating misinformation like a biological threat changes our approach to public health. The goal is no longer just to shout louder facts, but to build psychological immunity against the mechanisms of denial itself.